Yes, they found the Chestnut Level Presbyterian Church. And along with the church, they found a community of Scots who welcomed them with open arms. Let's continue reading from Lands Where My Fathers Died by Jack Stewart.
In our last session, we were looking for the Chestnut Level Presbyterian Church. That would be in Drumore in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So after about 15 miles, a narrow wagon road split off to the right, just where the wagon vendor had said it should be. Samuel drove down this road, hoping he was on the right track and wouldn't have to retrace his path. He especially didn't want to explain to Mary if he had taken the wrong road. In a few minutes, a small log building appeared at a crossroads. A sign indicated that this was the Chestnut Level Presbyterian Church. Samuel pulled the wagon into the churchyard and stopped. Chestnut Level was so named because it was in a grove of chestnut trees at one of the only places that was level around. An early church was organized there in 1711, and the second meeting house, a log structure, was built in 1729 next to the cemetery at the foot of the hill, just south of the village of Chestnut Level. Later, a third Chestnut Level Presbyterian Church would be built of stone, starting in 1765 and completed after the Revolutionary War. This substantial structure is still in use, located at the intersection of Chestnut Level and River Roads. This beautiful building is an excellent monument to the skill, energy, and generosity of its builders and congregation from 1711 to the present. That church today is affiliated with the Presbyterian Church USA. Old trees surrounded the Chestnut Level Church. On the road leading to the church, Hugh observed that the area was densely forested except for clearings, where each new settler had cleared an area around his house big enough to grow crops to support his family. Typically, a pioneer built his log cabin first and then began clearing the land. They would cut down the large old trees and use them to build farmhouses and barns. Barns had foundations made with great oak logs up to 18 inches by 10 inches by 40 feet long. An example of one of the old trees is still there on a hill overlooking the Susquehannock River. A great beech tree stands over 128 feet tall and over 13 feet around at the trunk. This tree is over 400 years old and is located in what is now called Susquehannock State Park. It was there before Columbus discovered America. Samuel walked over to a nearby house to see if he could find any of the Scots-Irish who were living in this area. Hugh jumped out of the wagon and sat on a stump in the churchyard. He noticed how quiet this spot was. The silence was broken only by the occasional sound of birdsong. Never before in his life had he paid attention to the beauty of birds singing. Tom Smith described the same sounds in his book, Liberty Square Observed and Noted, in 2007. The author wrote, "Goldfinches, titmouse, and blue jays sing joyfully to their maker, with a solo sung by a Carolina wren. Suddenly complete silence when all stopped to pray." Reverend John Thompson, the minister who had been sent in 1730 by the Donegal Presbytery to establish the Presbyterian meeting house at Chestnut Level, met Samuel at the door. When Samuel introduced himself, the minister was glad to see him, not surprised that yet another Ulster Scot family was here in this rapidly growing community. Samuel explained that they were Christian believers and would be attending the church. "Wait in the churchyard. Some of your brethren will come to meet you shortly," the minister said. Samuel knew that many Scots and a few Stewarts were already in Drumore Township. Drumore in 1729 was one of the original townships organized in Pennsylvania. It was named after Drumore, the town he had just left in Northern Ireland, and was settled principally by Scots Irish Presbyterians. Letters had arrived in Ireland before he left, telling about this community, surrounded by breathtaking landscapes of rolling hills, streams, valleys, woodlands, and family farms. John Stewart had 200 acres at Chestnut Level, and Thomas Stewart had 100 acres. Both had land warrants issued in 1734. In 1735, James Stewart received a warrant for 2 pieces of property with a total of over 400 acres. Some of these Stewarts could well have been relatives that Samuel and Hugh Stewart had never met. However, if they weren't related, they were Scots-Irish and would gladly help the newly arrived family get settled. They would welcome the extra labor that a strong man like Samuel could bring to help with their farm, and even a 16-year-old boy like Hugh could be a big help. A wagon came up the road to the churchyard, and with a hearty, "Good morning, folks, God blessing on you," 2 fellow Scots welcomed their newly arrived compatriots. They explained that usually when a new arrival came to the community, someone would find a vacant log cabin that predecessors built 30 or so years ago, and then when they completed their permanent house, the cabin would again be available for temporary use such as this. They found lodging for the Stewarts in Drumore Township until they could find their own property and build their home. Drumore Township, in the Susquehanna Valley of Lancaster County, consists of limestone soil, known as the finest agricultural land east of the Mississippi River, and the best non-irrigated farmland in the nation. Farms were family-owned, growing tobacco for the market, and grains to feed the horses and cattle they owned. The area's first farmers were the Indians, who had inhabited the area for the past 11,000 years. When William Penn visited the area in 1684, there were a few Indians from the once powerful Susquehanna tribe, but the Conestogas outnumbered them. By 1714, Scottish Presbyterians had started arriving in waves, and the area rapidly filled with immigrants. The demand for real estate assumed great importance and proved a headache as the Quaker Assembly had to mediate between the immigrants and the Indians. The English Quakers held power in the Assembly for only a short time until the Scots quickly outnumbered them. In 1735, Indians outnumbered white settlers and remained in undisturbed possession of their wigwams. They saw the rapid growth of the white man, but never foresaw that in a few years they would be almost entirely exterminated by them. They cultivated the amity and friendship of their white neighbors and were sociable with them. But the enactment of several treaties from 1736 through 1749 extinguished the Indians' claims to their land and awarded it to the new settlers. One of the infamous treaties, called the Walking Treaty, took place in 1737. Thomas Penn, son of William Penn, falsely told the Indians that land that could be covered in a walk of 1 1/2 days would be deeded to the Penns. The Indians envisioned a leisurely walk through the tangled Pennsylvania forest, but Thomas Penn had a straight path cleared and hired 3 of the fastest runners in the territory to run the path. The Indians gave up 1,200 square miles of land that day. The document later proved to be a forgery. The Indian chief, Lapawinasso, expressed the frustration and dissatisfaction of the tribe, but felt honor bound to fulfill the agreement, and they started their movement westward. Each time the government promised that would be their permanent home, only to force them to move again. By 1785, the Indian tribes in the entire state of Pennsylvania were wholly extinguished by other treaties, except for 640 acres on the Allegheny River. They were maligned this way for 130 years, until they were finally settled in what was known as Indian Territory now called Oklahoma. On August 8, 1738, 3 years after he arrived in town, Samuel Stewart was granted a warrant for 184 acres of land in Coleraine, the township adjacent to Drumore. The thorny issue of the state line between Pennsylvania and Maryland remained a hot item during the years that Hugh and Samuel Stewart were in Lancaster County. Some lands that William Penn had been granted were being encroached upon by Marylanders who claimed them for their own. The foresight to bring fighting Scots-Irish into this part of Pennsylvania proved to be justified, as the early settlers fought to keep the land in its proper province. Finally, the issue was settled when 2 surveyors, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, charted the official state boundary in 1767. They placed stones at 5-mile intervals to mark the line. Samuel's property was just 9 miles north of the state line. Samuel and Mary made their home there as their family expanded rapidly. Their son Elijah was born in 1738, and in 1740 they had their only daughter, Mary. Later children included Andrew, James, Hugh, Joseph, and Anthony. These 7 children, plus their 3 older sons born in Ireland, John, Robert, and Sammy, gave Samuel and Mary the large family they needed to run the farm and confront the elements that all early American settlers had to face. Farm life, though demanding, had its benefits. The farm families always had enough to eat. Mary, who had vowed never to be hungry again when she got off that ship in Philadelphia, grew to weigh 200 pounds. By concentrating on grains and livestock, the average farmer in the region around Lancaster grew a marketable surplus and, at the same time, created a nearly self-sufficient existence for himself. There was a heavy concentration on wheat as a money crop, which led this area to be called the colonial breadbasket. They took care not to exhaust the fertility of the soil, but used primitive techniques of crop rotation. The style of agriculture in this area made it the archetype of the agriculture that would eventually dominate the great river valleys of the Middle West. Farmers like Samuel grew corn, beans, and potatoes for their own family's use. Tobacco was a money crop that could be sold for export, and sometimes flax. Hay, straw, and grain were grown for the animals. Each farm kept a cow and sometimes a calf to provide milk for the family. A few farmers had a bull to keep the cattle population in the area served. Families always raised a few hogs, so there would be one to butcher each fall. In addition, they provided for enough horses to ensure their own transportation and for working the farm. And everybody had chickens.
Sam and Mary Stewart made a wonderful home in Drumore, and it seems as if everything is going their way. Next week, we'll find out how Hugh Stewart is handling life in the new country. See you next week.